Welcome to the Computational Antitrust podcast. My name is Thibaut Schrepel. I'm a faculty affiliate at Stanford University Codex Center and the creator of the Computational Antitrust project, which explores how legal informatics can benefit antitrust law. The project brings together over 65 competition agencies and 35 academics in the advisory board. Each month or so, we publish an academic article on the subject of computational antitrust. You may find these publications at computationalantitrust.com. Today, I am thrilled to be receiving Marcela Mattiuzzo, who co-authored the paper for us entitled Algorithmic Governance in Computational Antitrust, a brief outline of alternatives for policymakers. Marcela is a PhD candidate at the University of Sao Paulo and also a practitioner, which shows, I think, in the paper where you get both an academic and a practical perspective. So without further ado, Marcela, I'm very delighted to have a conversation with you. Welcome. I think that you are joining us from Brazil, right? Are you in Sao Paulo right now?
Yeah, I am. And thank you so much, Thibaut, for the invitation, for the chance also to write the paper. I think it was a very interesting exercise, because you reflect on issues a lot and then putting them in paper is a whole different experience, right? So thank
Yes,
you.
and
Thank you a lot.
what I enjoyed very much is how your ability to capture a huge debate what's happening outside of antitrust regarding the use of algorithm and AI and try to see how this fits in antitrust. And actually, that's the first things that I wanted to ask you to do, which is to summarize the main point of your paper in just 1 or 2 minutes.
Sure, perfect. So as you said, right, what we're trying to do here is bring together the discussion about computational antitrust and algorithmic governance. How exactly? The idea is that computational antitrust will bring about a need for, carefulness in a way regarding due process requirements, because after all, we have agencies implementing antitrust law. So we then try to explore some contributions from the algorithmic governance literature that could help overcome some of the issues that are faced here. And of course, we don't offer final solutions, but what we try to do is focus on what precisely the automation in question aims at achieving in order to think about the possible ways forward in that specific case, right? So we 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 try to differentiate, for example, what is like pure automation, simple automation, as some people call it, from AI automation, right? Which is, like, as you very well know, two entirely different worlds. We also try to differentiate when the algorithm is helping in a very procedural aspect of decision making and when it is indeed focusing on a more substantial aspect of decision making, and try to offer ways for authorities and everyone, of course, academia, civil society, to think about this problem.
Yeah, that's great. And so, as you said, you don't have all the answers. No one has all the answers. That's the beauty of the
Yeah.
field and why it's very exciting. And I think it's something that appears and actually came to my mind when reading the paper for the first time is that some of the issues that you discussed are, in my view, to be answered by computer scientists because you could get to technical solutions. Some other ones are clearly for us, the lawyers, right? And of course, it means that we need to work with computer scientists and vice versa. But to make it concrete, you say, for example, that algorithms may need to incorporate due process and fair trial safeguards before applying the penalties. And then later on in the paper, you actually mention, as you already said, that the AI may just be, of assistance, but not necessarily the thing taking the decision. And immediately I thought about the boxing method described by Nick Bostrom, the fact that you may want to limit where the AI output apply, right? So in a sense, you cut the bridge between the AI output and the real space, and you just ask the AI to generate the output, and you take that into consideration when making a decision. But it's not the AI that will actually implement that itself. And so I'm wondering if you agree that this is where technical solution may be a good workaround, and when drafting the paper, which issues you thought were for computer scientists to answer, because I know that some of them may be listening to us, so it's often good to know where what to research in the space.
Yeah, perfect. I think it's a very good question. And the way I see it is that, again, focusing on this distinction between traditional automation and AI, when we look at traditional automation, pretty much all of the legal issues that we have to solve for this to apply, for example, for an antitrust agency, are indeed legal issues, right? We just have to regulate it because automation is basically doing exactly what you say it should do, right? So unless, I mean, if programmers are listening to us, unless some of them made a mistake in the code that leads to a result that is not the result that was intended, which would be like a technical problem, um, everything else, the solution's pretty much there, right? So, and I even think that for some issues that antitrust agencies face, this traditional type of automation could be really great for legal certainty, right? Because, I mean, algorithms pretty much don't have bias. They can have inherent bias that we put there, but if you ask them to add 2 plus 2, they will just do that, right? Um, so in that regard, I think a lot of the legal issues are pretty much easy to solve in a way. We just have to be conscious of them. For example, making sure that if we have a decision that is being carried out by an algorithm, for example, that is clear to whoever that decision is applying to, and we make sure that that algorithm can be to some extent at least verified. Okay, is this bringing the result that I wanted it to bring? Is the code right? Is it not? And those are easy questions and therefore easy solutions. As you mentioned, it gets more challenging when you get to AI, because especially if you give AI the power to effectively contribute to the substantive part of decision making. And one thing that I think is important to add here is that there's a large literature in algorithmic governance that has already identified on the part of computer scientists that if you focus too much on something being explainable in terms of AI, then it will kind of necessarily lose accuracy. And that is something that you definitely do not want, right? So you want your algorithm to be as precise as possible and to help you solve the complex issue that you have. Therefore, you kind of have to balance those two things and say, okay, maybe I don't want it to be that perfectly transparent and explainable simply because I want it to be more accurate. And I think this is where the real challenge is, right? So, boxing, for example, as you mentioned, it is in a way it's limiting the system, right? So it's saying, okay, you will focus on this part of the problem, and then the rest of the solution is something that I will come up, I myself,
Mm.
natural person, will come up using your input, the input from the AI. And maybe, like, if you look at the example of COVID, it's great. Like, if you put a system there that has absolutely no idea what the problem with COVID is, and it simply looks at the images, maybe will come with terrific diagnostic results, but you will have a really hard time explaining why precisely the system came up with that conclusion, because it is simply looking at patterns that you yourself are not necessarily seeing, right? So I think that for computer scientists, that is the real challenge. Like, how can you develop things, algorithms that focus on AI, use AR, and are to at least the necessary extent explainable, right? And I mean, I would not entirely focus on transparency. I think that is a non-issue here.
Mm.
We already know it doesn't work, but explainability to some extent, if you're looking at an agency using that algorithm for decision making, will be essential, because everything else I think we legal folks can help do, but that is something that it's, I mean, at the current moment outside of our scope.
And so for the non-AI, this makes me think about what some people call the law of the code, right? What the code says is actually the law of the system. And I mean, there is a famous example in the blockchain environment where some people coded a smart contract, some people were able to extract money from it, and part of the community said, well, that's what the code says, so it should be the law. And indeed, I mean, there you can control what's going to be the output based on the code. So for that, great when it comes to auditability and the transparency. But for the AI, I often, when I teach AI to my students, take the example and show them the example of GPT-3, which is a API, performing natural language processing. And what I showed them is that depending on the temperature that you choose, it may come up with different results. And to supplement what you said, if I actually put a very low temperature, the AI is very predictable. So in a sense, transparency is 100%. So if I give, as an example, the order to generate questions about computational antitrust, it will come up with a list of questions. And if the temperature is low, every time I will ask that or give that order, the questions will be exactly the same, which of course is good, right, to limit liability. But when it comes to being imaginative and innovative and come up with something which is helpful, well, it's close to zero. If on the contrary I put a very high temperature, every time I will give the order, it will come up with a list of different questions, which is good because it means that I could get to the result that I want. But for liability, it's an absolute nightmare, right? Because you have no idea what the AI system will do. So is that the kind of trade-off that you have in mind? Because generally speaking, we tend to put the trade-offs on the side and pretend that everything's easy and there is just one great solution. So is that what you have in mind?
Yeah, precisely. And I think that that coupled with the fact that we're looking at an agency, right? So that was their focus. Okay, so when you bring that to the state making decisions, right? So in most jurisdictions, you have even higher standards for how the decision is being made. How well are you able to justify it, right? Because there's a whole issue of legal certainty and being able to demonstrate to the economic agents what exactly is it that you're trying to punish, how, why, how does that fall within the legislation, how does it not,
Mm,
etc. Even so that they can, if they want, to challenge your decision.
yeah.
So whenever you deviate from anything that is able to some extent answer those questions, it tends to become a problem for the agency, right? Because they'll
Yeah.
have trouble answering those questions. But and this I think, Chibo, is very interesting. I mean, I'm not saying that human decision making necessarily gives great answers to all of those questions. I think we know that it doesn't. And I mean that we could challenge how exactly certain are decisions in some agencies. And I mean, we can go far beyond antitrust here, right? um, but well, we have developed a methodology to deal with that problem when the decision is simply human made, and we're starting that process for
Mm,
automation, right?
yeah.
So we need to come up, we need to have that in mind. I mean, I try to think at my time at the agency, I would say, okay, this is something that I really see the potential in the technology, but I have to solve this issue because otherwise a perfectly great technology will not be used simply because of a legal problem that I'm not being able to solve. So I think that is the real issue, right? And liability for sure has a huge has a huge impact here.
Yeah, which are two extremes. One are the maximalists. Everything is tech solvable, so those are the tech solutionists. And on the other end, you have all the skeptics, the people saying that because it creates problems, it should not be applied at all. But so
No.
going to the enforcement world, I think you already mentioned and in the paper explore some issues which are more fundamental in a sense, because I'm not sure which solutions we could put on the table in 2022. For instance, you point out that certain industries where the data is more easily accessible are will face more intense scrutiny by agencies, because it will be easier for them to use the tools and to actually detect and monitor what's happening on those markets. And I think, in fact, the same goes for specific practices within those markets, right? So if it's price related, such as predatory pricing, then it's easier to detect because you can compute, the strategy than a quality-based practice where if you start to challenge the quality of a product, I mean, that's extremely hard to compute and to put in numbers. And so I think it's fair to say that agencies will go there because it's low hanging fruit. So those industries and after those practices, and it might be indeed that we will miss one important element here, which is that not everything can be computed and non-computable elements are very important. So my question is, what do we do? Should we draft guidelines for antitrust agencies? Should they publish clear enforcement agendas? Explore and explain which industries they will target every year, or maybe they should do something else. So, do you have any proposal here to put on the table?
Sure, that's also a great question. I think, yeah, I think of guidelines more like something you published once you've had sufficient experience regarding a certain topic that you feel confident enough to say, okay, so generally speaking, this is what happens and this is how I handle this problem, right? And I think we're not at the moment for this issue particularly. So I wouldn't go in that direction right now. Certainly in the future, it's something that should be considered by agencies. But I think it would be easier for them to perhaps be more transparent about their enforcement targets. I mean, of course, they cannot say, we're looking specifically at that company in this market. I mean, they won't say that because it will hinder the investigation. But generally, explaining industries in which they are focusing on, or perhaps, as you mentioned, right, broad characterizations of practices could be very helpful. It could also be very helpful for not just for them and for the companies, but it could also be very helpful for academia, right? Okay, so if those agencies are looking at this problem, maybe this is where I should focus on my intellectual production to try and come up with ideas and solutions and discussions that help form that body of knowledge. So I wouldn't very much go in the way of guidelines at this moment, but I think it's very important for them to clarify what their main focus is. And I also think that because this will necessarily be a kind of try and error
Mm.
solution, as much as they can to phase out this process. So we're looking at this now and we're trying to see if it works and we're trying to see what comes out of it. And then if it's taking too much effort and it's not leading anywhere, just move on to something else, right? I mean, part of the scientific process in this is understanding where the problem is. And maybe if you're looking very hard at it and you're not finding anything, it's just because there's nothing there to be found. You should move on to something else. And I think this process will be very important for us to for the agencies to know exactly how the computational tools can help them, and how they cannot, right? What is profitable from using this technology and what isn't.
Yeah, and on the very last point, to move on, uh, one suggestion would be to make it public, right? To make it known that we've looked into this market, we've looked into this industry, we've used those tools, and we couldn't find anything, or we couldn't actually justify the practice. Because what you see with some agencies is that they will actually publish the statement of objection, and then you'll never hear about the case anymore. And I mean, you could guess that if nothing happens for 20 years, it probably is that the agencies indeed decided to move on. But it would be great to get the reason why, to provide with more transparency, as you put it. And so there is the transparency regarding the agenda or the enforcement action of the agency, and then there is, as you explain, a difference to be made between the transparency and explainability when it comes to the actual tool that you are using, right? So especially if you use the algorithm, the idea is to avoid the situation where agencies could just say, "Oh, it's not me, it's the algorithm," right? And so you make actually a difference between those two, transparency and explainability, regarding the way it performs. And so I'm wondering if you can explain what it means for antitrust agencies, but also maybe for the plaintiff and the defendants using those tools.
Yeah, sure. I think this is an excellent point. There was a lot of discussion about transparency versus explainability in the algorithmic governance literature. And I mean, just to take a step back, right? So, obviously, when you're saying transparency, what we usually mean is just that every single step of the process for the decision making is known, right? So, if you're talking about an algorithm, that usually means to some extent making the code public, right? Because that is how you see the step by step of the algorithm. Whereas when you focus on explainability, you're thinking more of understanding the decision making than of knowing every single step that was taken at every single moment in time.
Hmm.
And again, that is particularly relevant when we think of AI. Why? Well, obviously, there's the initial issue that not all of us can understand programming language. So if things are transparent for some of us, it's just, okay, I don't understand a single word of this. But the more relevant issue here is sometimes, especially when you're focusing on AI tools, being transparent doesn't mean you can understand what is going on, even if you understand programming language.
Hmm.
So you look at it and you say, okay, I don't know how it goes from point A to point B, right? So that is why explainability became such a relevant discussion, because it reaches the goal that, in theory, when you think from a legal perspective, transparency was meant to reach, right?
Hmm.
Which is, okay, if I know every single step of the decision making process, therefore I am able to conclude how this decision was made. And that is simply not true for AI, right?
Yeah.
So that's why explainability ends up being so important. And I think that when we look at this from the perspective of antitrust agencies, well, first, they should understand that, of course. They should know that providing transparency for the mechanisms is not necessarily the best option. And sometimes it's not even feasible. So, divesting efforts in that direction may not be particularly interesting. And it's much more important to make sure that what you're doing is explainable. And then again, we go back to, how is your system being used? How is your algorithm being employed? Is it being employed for, I don't know, is it being employed just to count the days till a deadline, which would be very simple use that is still, like being a lawyer, I would say very useful. Or is it being used for, a substantive part of the decision making? So I think that difference is crucial. We have to be aware of it when we're implementing the decision making process, the algorithm, and be aware that depending on the type of mechanism we're using, it will demand different solutions from us, from the side of algorithmic governance.
And regarding the transparency for everyone listening to us, what you may want to Google or Bing or DuckDuckGo is the what is a bytecode. And so what you see is that at the very core, the machine is actually taking a computer programming language such as, I don't know, Solidity, Python, C++, and is actually translating that using different mechanisms depending on the language. But at the core of it, you do have a bytecode, which are a bunch of zeros and ones. And going to the blockchain sphere, what you see sometimes is that the bytecode of a transaction is available, but no one can actually have a look at zeros and ones and understand what's behind it. So it is fully transparent. I mean, the entire code is here, but it is indeed, when it comes to explainability, it is close to zero because you have no idea what's behind it. So if we indeed move to a target of explainability, then we go to the realm of auditability, right? And you explore in the paper the possibility to require third party to review the methods used by the algorithms employed by agencies, especially those reaching conclusions. And so you further elaborate, exploring best practices in the space, and indeed a few have been put on the table outside of antitrust, but I think that's the beauty of your paper. You explain how this translates in our world. But I do wonder if, in your view, if law firms and antitrust agencies should disclose their database for third party to explore, or maybe it should be that they should disclose the code of the algorithm, or maybe they should make some sort of meta information available, or they should make the tests that they've run to make sure that the algorithm is, processing as it should. So what degree of auditability would you require here for agencies and law firms?
Yeah, so for law firms first, I think it's very hard to require anything from law firms at this point. I think for sure, unless they're to some extent using that for enforcing something,
Yeah.
it would be very contestable in any legal grounds. But for sure, I mean, it might be that they themselves see that it's interesting to, for example, make a certain database public that they have created and they have compiled, because that could further research into certain topics, find patterns that other people use that database to find that they were not envisioning, and that could profit them, right? So if you have a huge database at your law firm that you have compiled over the 20, 30 years that you are in practice, and you want to make that public and say, okay, researchers, do
Yeah.
you want to take a look at this and find problems and find potential solutions? That could be terrific, right? And it could open up a whole lot of possibilities. But looking at the side of the agency, on the other hand, I don't think we should depart from a premise that the code should always be public, or any sort of idea on that front. Notably because, and we've had that discussion in Brazil quite a lot, because we have some courts, and the Supreme Court especially, using an AI mechanism to do something that is very important for decision making, which is the distribution of the cases among the reporting
Mm.
judges, right? So there was a huge discussion on whether or not that code should be made public, or whether it should simply be auditable, right? They should hire someone that is able to audit that information. Or in this particular case, it was a compilation of researchers that looked at it and drafted a report explaining how that followed all legal requirements of the process that are in the legislation. And my view of auditability for agencies goes more in that direction, right? So ensuring that, of course, when the agency sees fit, it publishes the database. When the agency says fit, it publishes the metadata. But as a rule, not publishing the code itself. And why is that? I think, Thibault, that one real issue we have here is that maybe companies will learn too much if they have the code, right? They will have a too much of an insight into how the agency is coming to the conclusions it's coming, and then they will be able to perhaps trick the algorithm. It may be that it won't happen, but it's a risk, right? We know it's possible. So I wouldn't by default say, okay, you have to have everything perfectly published online for anyone who wants to take a look at it. But this sense of auditability in ensuring that the process can be followed and validated by external experts would not only be good for the antitrust community as a whole, but I think it would strengthen the agency's decisions quite a lot, right?
Yeah.
Because if you have a bunch of researchers saying, okay, this mechanism works, it follows due process, it's everything is fine here, then it's much harder if you want to contest it. And then just one final aspect is the issue of what would happen if this algorithm was used in a decision, right, in a specific investigation that led to a specific outcome that a company A, B, X, doesn't really matter, um, came to be found in violation of antitrust laws, right? So should that company have access to more information if it decides to, for example, challenge the decision,
Mm,
or should it not, right? I mean, again, my view is that as long as the algorithm is explainable, they wouldn't necessarily have a right to see the code, but that could be, brought about by a third party that is responsible for auditing the algorithm, which, in my view, ideally should not be a judge, because that wouldn't work. I mean, at least in Brazil, it for sure wouldn't. I mean, you have to have a specialist technician that would be able to do that process.
yeah, so I have two thoughts. The first is, of course, it depends on the reason why you may want to use computational tools. I think it's fair to say that the vast majority of companies want to be antitrust compliant, right? They're not here trying
Sure.
every day to imagine how they could infringe the law. And so it might be that for certain use cases, well, making the code public is actually good because the company may be more easily compliant. And so that's one space. The other one, of course, is when you want to infringe antitrust, and there indeed the issue of the adversity that you may have in the system, I think, will become a big one. We see already that when it comes to face recognition, you can actually put one invisible pixel, or at least invisible to the human eye, inside the picture, and this will actually mess up with the face recognition system.
I'm with you.
And something similar could be imagined for antitrust, right? You do a price variation this time of the day, and you know that the algorithm detecting the cartel will actually be all mixed up. So for sure, we're going to see a war there, or at least a battle. But something that you mentioned, and that's my point number two, is the issue of expertise. If indeed there is no in-house expertise, whether we talk about an agency, a court, or maybe even a law firm, right, a plaintiff or a defendant, then you can always indeed go to third parties and ask for a report. But still, you want to be able to understand the report, right, and not take it for granted. So you still need to have some sort of expertise. I think in Brazil, at the antitrust agencies, you are lucky because I know the agency is pretty active when it comes to computational antitrust, and there is a real willingness to invest in the space. But what about an agency or a law firm with no computer experience at all? It means they're going to have to take for granted everything they receive. So it might be that, again, it's a good idea to hire in the space. I don't know if you have any reaction here, but it seems to me that it's a
Yeah.
big subject.
No, I absolutely. I think your point is perfect, right? So, I mean, that came about. I think the example of human resources inclusive conduct is great here to show your point, right? So we can be thinking of companies that know they're engaging in some form of wage fixing, and they want to hide that. But especially in the case of Brazil, I can say that, I mean, there were a lot of benchmarking that was going on regarding HR
Mm,
practices that companies had no idea what they were doing could ever be considered like a problem for antitrust. And that is true for a lot of the practices that we have. So making sure that you are aware of that difference in order to decide whether you publish your results, the results of your algorithm, can be absolutely essential. And again, I think your point about how do I interpret the data that I receive from a third party, or something, the way I see this is similar to the way I see economics, right?
exactly.
So you don't necessarily have to have lawyers that are
No.
economists, right? They don't have to have a PhD in economics, but they need to be able to interpret the information they
Yeah.
receive. So I mean, that's kind of the way I see it today. We will have to more and more have people that are able to interpret and find a way to dialogue with those professionals, even they if they don't have a degree in computer science, or anything of the
Yeah,
sort.
and especially maybe in private enforcement, right? Because of course the two
Sure.
parties will come up with experts with a different opinion, you know,
Yeah.
substantiating the point that they're trying to make. So it might be that some expertise, in-house expertise, is required, and that there is no workaround. And so this leads me to the final impossible question that I like to ask everyone here in this podcast. Where do you think we'll be in 10 years from now in terms of what is possible to achieve in the field of antitrust using computational tools?
Yeah, as you said, it's an impossible question. But I think that for sure we will at least have screening mechanisms that are a lot better than anything we could envision today, right? I think that that is certain for cartels, in my view. We already know that a lot of the traditional methods for finding cartels are no longer working, largely also because companies are engaging way less in this kind of practice given enforcement over the years. But given how agencies are dealing with collusive behavior that is less looking like a traditional cartel and also going after that like exchanges of information, and so I would bet money on having screening mechanisms that look at that. And I also think, and that is also owning to a lot of the work that has been done at the Computational Antitrust Project at Stanford, that perhaps we will have tools that are more accurate and help us deal with mergers, right? So a lot of the calculations that go on there, a lot of the models that we have, that economics already has a large experience in that, but I think it will become a lot better, especially when we think of dynamic competition, right? So how do we see that in time? I think those are the two bets that I would be willing to do in regards of where we're going to be, where we will develop more in terms of computational
Yeah, well,
antitrust.
sounds good to me. I'm also willing to put money there on the table. This makes me think about, maybe the need one day to explore prediction markets to indeed force people to put money where the mouth is, which might be convenient when it comes to market study. That's a different topic for a different day. When it comes to merger control, indeed, we published quite a few papers in the space, including one about micro directives, another one about using machine learning to better detect kill acquisitions, and all that appears in your great article. One forthcoming article that we have will deal with market surveillance and all the issues that it poses in the space. So keep an eye on it. In the meantime, Marcela, thank you very much for this great conversation. I hope to see you in person in Brazil. It's always such a pleasure to be in your country. So take care, and I hope to see you soon. Bye bye.
Yeah, me too. Bye bye.